Hello, everyone. Welcome to an online seminar on Palestine and the question of transnational feminist solidarity. We bring you this seminar from the Department of Gender Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles. My name is Sherene Razack, and I'm the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies, and I'm also the Chair of Gender Studies. Today, we consider what is a feminist analysis of this unfolding genocide and what are the possibilities for a transnational feminist solidarity on the question of Palestine. In early February of 2024, the French Minister for Gender Equality announced that she would withdraw funding from feminist groups who did not hold the same analysis of what happened on October 7th during the Hamas attacks in Israel. Principally, she said, if feminists did not agree that thousands and thousands of women were raped and killed, and if they did not condemn Hamas, they would lose funding. Feminist groups repeated over and over again that they condemned all violence and that they condemned all violence against women in particular. But they wanted to consider what was the evidence for mass rapes committed by Hamas on October 7th. Even when the extent and description of the violence that the French minister advanced was proven to be false, thousands and thousands of women were not brutally killed and mass raped, feminist groups were still condemned and were told they would be denied funding, and all of this would occur through policy and law. The targeting of feminist groups for censure and their failure to, their accusation that they failed to care about Israeli women and failed to care about violence against Israeli women really turns on a very specific notion of gender and a very specific notion of gender violence. Consequently, it also turns on a very specific notion of feminist politics. So simply put, the sexual violation of Israeli women, about which feminists are presumed to care the most, counts more than any other violence, such as violence done to Palestinian women or to Palestinian people. A very obvious immediate distinction here is that there is a racial line operating through this idea of gender violence. On one side of the equation, you have one group of women, Israelis, who are always understood to be Jewish and white or of European origin. That is how they are understood popularly, in contradistinction to Palestinian women, who are always understood to be not white and Muslim. And this is regardless of what the actual reality is. And so this racial line operates between the two groups, that you have one group that's white and liberal and modern and committed to gender equality, and you have another group belonging to non-white people who are pre-modern, who are not advanced enough, and who are not committed to gender equality. So this racial line is pretty obvious. The analytical foundation that supports this racial hierarchy is the idea that feminists should care the most about sexual violence, leaving other forms of violence for other people to think about. So when feminists are scripted as social actors who should care only about sexual violence, we're actually consigned to a field where the women we care about, women who are sexually violated, are stripped of any other part of their history. So what emerges is a kind of formula. It's a single axis explanation that leaves other parts of women's lives completely in shadow. The understanding that gender is principally about women who are at risk of sexual violence or who are targeted for sexual violence, this introduces the idea of a universal woman. If this is who all women are, and this is how you define who all women are, then women who don't have this part of their biography as the only part of their biography that matters are necessarily not as much women, or not even women at all. The end result is that some women disappear as women, leaving in place a type of woman who is the only legitimate subject of feminism. The end result is that only some women can inhabit that space we call gender legitimately, and everyone else is booted out of it. This is very similar to an argument that we get in Black studies and famously by Hortense Spillers, who argued that Black women are ungendered. That is to say, their own sexual violation, their reproductive lives, mark them not as women, but as property. So they are booted out. They are ungendered. Evictions from gender occurs very differently for each group of women. Black women are booted out because they are not women, they're property. But Palestinian women are booted out because they don't come into the screen as women. They come into the screen as Hamas. Race in this scenario gives content to the story of sexual violation as the single axis of oppression in women's lives. One important aspect of this is that Israeli women's sexual violation enters our visual field, and we're able to see it through race. That is, we're able to see it through understanding that what Israeli women have suffered is the barbarism of Palestinian men, of Hamas. Relatedly, Palestinian women can't enter our visual field as targets of sexual violence unless we understand that as targets of sexual violence, they're really targeted by their own men. So we can see the sexual violence if it comes from their own men. We cannot imagine, for example, that Palestinian women might be targeted by the Israeli Defense Forces or Israeli soldiers. So their sexual violence and consequently their standing as victims doesn't really come into the picture unless we consider the racial aspect of the explanation. So what I most like to say, it echoes a phrase from the historian George Massey, that race hitches a ride on gender. And this results in the expulsion of Palestinian women from the category women, and most importantly, from the category of law. So one way to understand the landmines that feminists have to navigate as they cross this political field is to understand how race and gender are co-constituted here. And what I mean by co-constitution is, how does race make gender? How does gender make race? How does one category actually get its content from another? Sometimes this sounds like an impossibly kind of abstract relation, and I really want to consider how these two things, race and gender, are operating in this understanding of what feminists should care about and which kind of violence matters the most. So it's not a new thing that feminists have been condemned for expressing any kind of support for Palestinians. As a scholar, for example, who speaks on these issues, regularly in my inbox, I get messages. And I can read you some of these messages to show you what it is actually happens analytically. So I will get a message, for example, for someone who studies violence against women, you don't understand what rape and torture of women mean. You should get fired. These messages always come with some kind of sanction. You should get fired, you should get disciplined, you shouldn't be allowed to teach. There's another kind of email I get, and I'm actually reading you the text of the kind of email that crosses my desk. I am writing to you to express my pain and deep concern over the very fact that you even allowed an event entitled Crisis in Palestine to be held at a time when news of Israeli women being mass raped, babies being beheaded, children and elderly being violently kidnapped, and innocents being mass slaughtered by the hundreds by the self-proclaimed Palestinian leaders, Hamas. Sometimes my inbox or when I give a talk, sometimes I'm confronted with something a little scaled down, and that is, do you know that queer people would be killed in Palestine? whereas Israel supports gay rights. This is a standard example of the strategy known as pinkwashing, which, as many scholars have explained, is a strategy that misrepresents Israel's record on LGBTQ rights in order to present the argument that Israel is liberal, democratic, and feminist in contradistinction to Palestinians. So the racial line that underpins this kind of these messages is it's a very obvious one. It's not subtle at all. On the one side, these barbaric peoples who are especially misogynist and sexist. On the other side, these very modern peoples who are very liberal. So as the logic goes, to be in support of Israel is to be feminist, and to be in support of Palestinians is to be anti-feminist. Pretty simple line. So, and the logic, as you can imagine, really turns on this idea of what I often call in my work racial phantoms. You have to have this image before you of a bearded, very patriarchal terrorist figure, Hamas. In your head, you have to have that example, floating around and manipulating your emotions in very specific ways. Sometimes the image of the uber patriarch, the terrorist man, actually is underpinned by specific academic notions, academic in quotation marks, such as Muslims possess a gene for violence. The first and the most important, maybe the most obvious thing to say about the call for feminists to acknowledge Israeli suffering and deny Palestinian suffering is that as racial discourse, this mode of communication actually proceeds by what many scholars call tabloid realism. And this is very simple. Communications really proceed by way of the kinds of headlines that you would see in a publication like the National Enquirer. That is to say, the discursive field is literally littered with beheaded babies, mass rapes. The visual field is populated with blood on the pants of Israeli women who were killed. You have images of women with their legs splayed and their underwear showing. And these types of images form a kind of sensationalist layer of headlines. And this is the mode of communication. What this is, these images generate what I would like to say is racial affect. That is to say, they provoke and they consolidate emotions that travel from body to body until it forms a kind of sediment or a layer in which there's a strong jolt, an affective charge in the collective unconscious that reasserts the idea of the racially superior subject as opposed to the inferior culture. As I've shown in my book, Nothing Has to Make Sense, Upholding White Supremacy Through Anti-Muslim Racism, these kinds of powerful emotions and the affect or the layer that they form, you see them traveling through law. So, for example, if you want to ban any mention of Islam in the curriculum, or if you want to ban Muslim clothing, or if you want to approve the torture and surveillance of Muslims, or if you want to legally authorize bombings, you actually need this powerful racial affect, because with it, all those things that you want to do begin to seem reasonable. And it's important that I say here that they begin to seem reasonable and not logical. So you can have the conviction that Muslim men or all Muslims carry a gene for violence. That is not actually logical or supported, but it begins to seem reasonable when these images of barbaric Muslim men flash across your mind. Nothing has to make sense, as the title of the book is really about, you don't need the logic. You just need the strong emotions and the racial affect, and that will provide the sense. I like to quote the legal scholar Colin Diane, who says, "The obscene is made lawful when blackness is in the room, expressing a kind of reason that defies logic. What do feminists do when they're confronted with a situation where nothing has to make sense? What we've been doing, all kinds of feminists have been doing this, is confronting the landscape of racial phantoms and the very powerful affect that they carry. We've been confronting that with logic. So many feminist scholars, Palestinians, non-Palestinian scholars, have, for example, pointed out the lies that the Israeli government has told about October 7th. They've pointed out the propaganda, really, with respect. For example, there were no beheaded babies. So feminists keep responding to this situation with logic. Look, you're lying about beheaded babies, and so we need to ask some questions about this. And the problem here is that our efforts to use something logical can't really compete with the images that are generated by this racial narrative. So, for example, the visual of an Israeli woman with blood on her pants really does not compete with images of whole neighborhoods in Gaza reduced to rubble. And if feminists, well-known feminists, maybe not so well-known feminists, Palestinian feminists such as Heba Zaghou, who died very early in the bombings with her two children, we can't tell that story and compete with the story of the blood on the pants. As Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian says in her powerful book, the children lying beneath the rubble are unchilded. They are never considered children in the racial imaginary. Children are snakes, as the Israeli justice minister called them. And their mothers lying in the rubble or giving birth in a hospital that is being bombed are not feminist victims. They are simply collateral damage. So whereas Israeli women can be seen as targets of sexual violence, Palestinian women cannot be seen either of targets of sexual violence or gender violence. As, for example, the Palestinian scholar Nadia Elia told us, Palestinian people's suffering is also gender violence, because Zionism is racism, and gender violence, Israeli gender violence against the Palestinian people, is an essential aspect of racism, of settler colonialism, of genocide. But this very important point that Elia makes, many other feminists make this point as well, is lost in this sort of war of images, if you like. If we take, for example, the reproductive violence that is directed towards Palestinian women and children chronically and eventfully, this cannot be acknowledged as gender violence because the violence is buried under demographic fears endorsing Israeli Jewish vulnerability. In other words, we can't worry about the reproductive violence directed at Palestinians if we worry about Jewish Israeli women's vulnerabilities. So those things have a relationship to each other. Where one disappears, the other comes into view. In this dynamic that occurs, Israeli women become what I'm calling the universal woman, the archetype of vulnerability and suffering. They become what gender means. So if Palestinian women's gender cannot emerge, either metaphorically or literally from under the rubble, it is because gender is trapped in this racial circuit of emotions. So then what is gender if it can be so easily disappeared? Here we must consider how Israeli women's gender emerges in the same moment that Palestinian women's gender disappears. Israeli women are imagined to singularly possess feminine vulnerability and feminized suffering. They are the woman who is vulnerable to mass rape. A very similar the same archetype, in fact, not similar, but the same archetype emerged in the 19th and 20th century in American racial terror campaigns, where these centered on the vulnerability of white women to rape from black men. And this image, mobilized. It mobilized law, actually. It mobilized a number of things where you had the lynching of Black men for this reason. The same archetype also surfaces in the 1990s feminist campaign that women's rights are human rights. The two-step logic of that campaign was that all women share common humanity. We're all the same. We share common humanity. And sexual violence against women is the most pervasive human rights abuse. So if the meaning of gender is what is done to women, as feminists like Catherine McKinnon famously argued with respect to women's rights or human rights, in this constellation of all the things that can happen to women, all the gendered wrongs, sexual violence is the worst. It has pride of place. McKinnon also famously argued that mass rapes carried out in wartime is genocidal rape. And this indeed is exactly what the Israeli state has advanced about October 7th. They've contended that there were mass rapes, and this mass rape is evidence of genocide, a genocide that Hamas is conducting against Israel. Notably, of course, this would mean there's no genocide going on by Israel against Palestinians. You can't, have an equivalence there. So, as in the campaign in the 1990s for women's rights are human rights, when sexual violence is highlighted, every other violence has to just drop out of the picture. It's very hard to put it back into the picture. And so what you see here is that a notion of gender narrowed down to the definition of a woman as someone who encounters sexual violence establishes a normative woman whose life is primarily uncontaminated by racial or colonial violence. So violence against women regularly comes into view in law through a racial colonial lens. And I can give this example from the 1990s when I was researching gender persecution laws. So states such as Canada, for example, actually Canada was the first country to pass gender persecution guidelines in its Immigration Act. And what these guidelines said was that if women were fleeing violent men and they were fleeing from states that were unwilling or unable to protect them, then they qualified for asylum. And what I learned through the research is that decision makers often understood and believed women and wanted to grant them asylum if they were fleeing men or states that were Muslim. That is to say, they understood and believed in the violence if they understood it to be coming from men they characterized as innately barbaric. So the concept of gender persecution really thrived in this fertile environment of imperialism and racism. Sexual violence was seldom acknowledged without this kind of imperial quoting. The women who could not easily trigger these ideas of the barbarism of their men or their states had a much more difficult time getting in. So this concept of a universal woman who is vulnerable to sexual violence packs a punch in law precisely because through it we're able to ignore all other factors, such as colonial dispossession, such as American imperialism, etc. Correspondingly, women of the first world came into our view as victims of gender violence, and they gain our empathy, providing we can see them as pure women who are oppressed, but not oppressors. Okay, so let us now consider how these kinds of racial and gendered calculations, how the universal woman has appeared in these discussions of October 7th and the alleged mass rapes and beheading of babies, etc. And I want to discuss one particular report because it attempts a complexity that many other reports on October 7th has not managed. So this is the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. And they issued a report on the extent of sexualized violence that we see on October 7th. And the report, as I've said, it really strives for objectivity. It doesn't shy away from what feminists like Elia called the weaponizing of rape. In fact, it struggles quite valiantly with two things. One is the overwhelming evidence that there is no evidence of mass rape. And simultaneously, it struggles with the astonishing lies and propaganda that have been told by the Israeli state and its supporters. So given these two things, the Lemkin report nevertheless concludes, given the evidence of sexualized violence on October 7th, the Lemkin Institute believes that sexualized violence took place and was widespread. So it reaches that conclusion in spite of its earlier premises that there is no evidence and there was massive propaganda. So how does this happen? How does nothing have to make sense in this particular instance? So let's think about what it is they actually talk about in the report. They talk about the fact that there was no photographic or forensic evidence of mass rape. It does not exist. That all the evidence that's been offered by the IDF or commentators who are well known to be anti-Palestinian have been falsified. It reveals lots of fabrications. For example, there were no beheaded babies. There are no witnesses to rape. The family of one woman whom the IDF chose to emphasize as having been raped, that family has announced categorically that their daughter was not raped and that they have been used by the IDF. All of this is happening. So, notwithstanding all of this, we come to believe in mass rape. And why do we do that? So, the Lemkin Institute says, if the Israeli state had not engaged in pernicious racist propaganda, we would all be able to see what is normally plain to see, which is that women are always sexually violated in war. Of course, you have to consider the important side issue. Is October 7th a war? But even putting that aside, the point is that women are always sexually violated in war, so we know that that is what happened on October 7th. And because we know this fundamental truth about what happens to women in war, we should believe women. Of course, the slight complication is that we have no women telling us that they were raped. We have people telling us about women who were raped. So there's a slight problem there. But, as I keep emphasizing, this is not about logic. Ironically, of course, the Israeli demonstrations that you've seen with women carrying placards saying, "We believe women," you cannot possibly imagine an equivalent placard, "We believe Palestinians," when they tell us 30,000 people have been killed. They can't, Palestinians and Palestinian women cannot emerge in the visual field for reasons that I have been saying. So now feminist groups who want to ask some questions about this are accused of being anti-Semitic. And we cannot, as feminists, easily refute this charge by stating the opposite of what is a fundamental feminist tenet, which is that women are targeted during militarization, are sexually targeted during militarization and war. We know this. Similarly, we can't really confront what is being said about October 7th by saying we don't believe women, because it is a fundamental feminist tenet that we believe women. And the reason we do is that they're very often not believed when they say that they've encountered sexual violence. We're in a paradoxical situation where things that we know to be absolutely true must be affirmed to be true on a field where no other factors can be allowed into the conversation. It's at least it's difficult for them to be allowed in. So the Lemkin Institute does actually bring in the factor of Israeli propaganda, but that doesn't interrupt or interfere with the final conclusion. And this is, I want to emphasize here that the tabloid realist mode is still operating here. And we're hearing all of these arguments amidst what I would call a racist din. So it's very hard to thread your way through this discussion. The gender that is being evoked in this conclusion, that we know that there were mass rapes because this is what happens to women all the time, is the gender of the universal woman. That is to say, this woman is invariably white because any other factors here are not operating and do not come into view. The feminist response and the most important basis of solidarity is to ask, what gets pushed out of the frame when we consider a universal woman, when we consider that gender, the meaning of gender is to be subjected to sexual violence, and that is how we know what gender is. What is left out of the frame? We should acknowledge that we are between a rock and a hard place in the imaginary of a universal woman, because we do know for certain that women are violated in war, and we do believe women. But what is left out of the frame? Dispossession, bombs, the cutting off of food and water and fuel, of course, the histories of the cutting off of food, water, and fuel, the extensive history of Gaza as an outdoor prison. All of this is out of the frame. And it's out of the frame because these things do not happen to women per se. And because they do not happen to women per se, they cannot be a feminist issue. So when the Palestine Feminist Collective insists that Palestine is a feminist issue and brings up these matters, it doesn't easily win the argument because of the racial affect that is in place. Race, the race of Palestinian women, drowns out any narrative of sexual violation. And instead, the genocidal violence that is directed at the people of Gaza is easily translated into a legitimate violence that we must do to root out Hamas, as the Israeli military keeps saying. Gaza has no real people. It only has Hamas. It has no real women either, because we don't see any evidence of their sexual violation. And that is all that we understand to be connected to gender and to a woman. So let me conclude with what sometimes sounds like a very abstract academic point. Gender is how you make the case for civilizational superiority and to the entitlement to the land that comes with it. Race is never just race. It's always gender, sexuality, and class operating through each other. The systems come into operation through each other, and they give content to each other. This is an effect that we often try to squeeze into the concept of intersectionality. When we use this concept too often, we understand it as a kind of diversity. One system is piling up on another, so you have gender and race piles up on it, and sexuality piles up on it, and class piles up on it. And that kind of mathematical piling up sometimes blocks our understanding of how one system becomes the other system. Solidarity really requires that we navigate this very complex geopolitical field attentive to the co-constitution of systems of oppression, rather than understand how the systems are discrete and merely complicate each other. Methodologically, a place to start is to think about how one system is the language of another system. How that is that a specific notion of gender gives content to racial hierarchies, and how racial hierarchies require a gendered cast of characters. It requires brutal, misogynist, racialized men. It requires invisible, racialized women. We don't think about them too much. And it requires white women who suffer and who suffer more than any other women.